My name is Ryan, and my father-in-law always saw me as a nobody. A burden. A man unworthy of his daughter. And my wife? She let him believe it. So they tried to erase me. To push me out like I was disposable. What they didn't know. The life they were so desperate to protect was mine all along. And by the time they realized it, they had already lost everything. Ryan Carter. That was my name, but to my father-in-law, Richard Adams, I was nothing more than a stain on his family name. A mistake his daughter would eventually correct. From the moment I married Sophia, he made it clear he didn't respect me and he never would. And I let him think that. The Adams family came from old money, the kind that thrived on power, connections, and the belief that wealth equaled worth. Richard had built his empire through calculated moves, stepping on anyone who got in his way. His wife, Diane, was just as ruthless in her own way, polished, smiling, but cruel beneath the surface. Their son, Ethan, was the golden child, the future heir to the Adams legacy. And then there was Sophia, beautiful, ambitious, but forever caught between the expectations of her family and the life she wanted for herself. They had money, but what they didn't have was control over me. I knew what they thought of me. Richard never missed a chance to remind me. Over expensive family dinners in their grand estate, he would sip his 100-year-old scotch, look at me with that smug, knowing smirk, and make backhanded comments. "So, Ryan, how's that little business of yours doing?" he'd ask, feigning interest, as if I was some struggling entrepreneur barely keeping my head above water. I'd smile. Still growing. He never knew just how much. Sophia, for the most part, stayed quiet during these interactions. She loved me in her way, but she loved her family's approval more. And Richard knew it. He used it, twisting the knife a little deeper each time, making sure she saw me through his eyes, less than. Not enough. A burden. And then one night he decided he was done waiting for her to come to her senses. I had just stepped out onto the balcony of their estate, away from the stiff formalities of yet another family dinner, when I overheard him. His voice was low but firm, the kind of voice that didn't invite argument. "Sophia, it's time to stop pretending," he said. "You need to leave him." My grip on my glass tightened. "Dad," she hesitated. "I mean it. I'll take care of everything. You won't have to fight for a cent, just sign the papers and we'll move forward. This marriage was a mistake, and you know it." I stood there, unseen, listening as my wife hesitated. As she wavered. As the man who despised me convinced her that I wasn't worth staying for. And that was the moment I decided I wasn't going to stop them. I was going to let them walk right into their own destruction. I didn't confront Sophia that night. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. Instead, I walked back inside, sat down at the dinner table, and listened as Richard laughed over his glass of scotch, already celebrating the victory he thought was inevitable. I played my role perfectly, the quiet, oblivious fool who had no idea what was coming. But Richard had no idea either. Over the next few days, I watched as the trap slowly closed in. Sophia grew distant, her smiles forced, her affection fading. Richard became bolder, his comments sharper, his disdain no longer hidden behind pleasantries. And Ethan? He followed his father's lead, treating me with thinly veiled amusement as if I was a guest overstaying my welcome. Then, the final move. One evening, Richard pulled me aside, his expression unreadable. "Ryan, let's be honest with each other," he said smoothly. "You've had a good run, but it's time to walk away." I tilted my head. "Walk away from what?" He smirked, sliding an envelope across the table. I opened it to find a check blank, waiting for a number of my choosing. "Whatever you think she's worth," he said. "Write it down and then disappear." I looked at the check, then back at him. He really thought this was a negotiation. That I had a price. I pushed the envelope back toward him, my expression calm. "You think I need your money?" I asked, my voice steady. Richard leaned back in his chair, his smirk unwavering. "I think you need to know when you're outmatched." I chuckled. Not because he was right, but because he had no idea how wrong he was. Before I continue the story, I want to connect with all of you, my incredible viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop the flag of your country in the comments below and let's see how far the story travels. Now, back to Richard's biggest mistake. He thought he was winning. He thought he was in control. He thought I was just some nobody who had gotten lucky marrying into his family. What he didn't know. The house he was sitting in, the one he took so much pride in, was mine. The company he bragged about where his son worked was mine. The wealth he thought made him powerful? It was nothing compared to mine. But I wasn't going to tell him that. Not yet. I stood up, adjusting my cufflinks, and gave him a slow, deliberate smile. "You're right, Richard," I said. "It's time to walk away." And I did. But not in the way he expected. Because I wasn't the one about to lose everything. He was. The moment I walked away, Richard thought he had won. In his mind, I was retreating, accepting my fate, tucking my tail between my legs like a man who knew he'd been beaten. What he didn't realize was that I had just given him the exact thing he wanted. The illusion of control. I let Sophia believe she was the one making the decision. Over the next few days, she acted differently, carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who thought she had the upper hand. She spoke to me less, avoided my gaze, and started talking to her mother in hushed voices about the next chapter of her life. And then, one evening, she finally said the words Richard had been waiting to hear. "Ryan, we need to talk." I sat across from her on our pristine white couch, watching as she carefully chose her words like a politician crafting a public statement. This isn't working anymore," she began, her voice soft but firm. "I love you, but we want different things." We. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for them. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I simply nodded. "If that's what you want." A flicker of surprise crossed her face. She had expected resistance. Maybe even a desperate attempt to change her mind. But all I did was stand up, grab my jacket, and give her one last look. "I'll make this easy for you, Sophia," I said. "I'll move out tonight." Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. She had no idea that she wasn't the one calling the shots. She thought she was walking away from me. But really, I was walking away from her and everything she thought she was entitled to. The next morning, the cracks in their perfect little world began to show. Richard's first clue that something was wrong came when he arrived at his country club for a routine meeting with his associates. As he ordered his usual overpriced espresso, the waiter hesitated before speaking. "Apologies, Mr. Adams, but it seems your club membership has been revoked." Richard's brows furrowed. "That's impossible." The waiter only shrugged, handing him a printed notice from the club's management. Richard barely read the words before storming out, pulling out his phone to call his bank. But the moment his financial advisor answered, he realized something was very, very wrong. The club wasn't the only thing he had lost. The estate, the grand, luxurious mansion where he had hosted countless galas and business meetings, wasn't in his name anymore. It never had been. While Richard paced his office, demanding answers from a team of lawyers who were now scrambling to salvage what little control he had left, his son Ethan was experiencing a downfall of his own. At the company he had once bragged about running, he walked into work expecting to be greeted with the usual nods of respect and admiration. Instead, he was met with awkward glances, murmurs behind his back, and an unexpected email in his inbox. Termination of employment, effective immediately. Ethan's heart pounded as he barged into his boss's office, only to be met with a calm, professional response. "This decision was made by the owner, Ethan. There's nothing I can do." The owner. Confused, furious, and desperate, Ethan did the one thing he swore he'd never do. He called me. When my phone rang, I let it go to voicemail. Then I listened as he stammered through a half-hearted attempt at demanding an explanation. "Ryan, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this is insane. You don't have the power to do this. You don't." I stopped the message there. "Oh, but I did." By the end of the day, the weight of reality had finally hit the Adams family like a freight train. Richard had lost his standing in the social circles he once ruled. Ethan had lost the job that had been handed to him on a silver platter. And Sophia? She had lost something far more valuable. Because that night, when she called me, I answered. "Ryan, what's happening?" she asked, her voice laced with confusion and something else, fear. I let the silence stretch just long enough for her to feel it. Then, with the same quiet confidence that Richard had once used to belittle me, I spoke. "Sophia, you wanted freedom," I said. "And now? You have it." She didn't respond right away. I could hear her breath hitch, like she was realizing too late that she had misunderstood everything. You knew," she finally whispered. I smiled. Of course I knew. I had known from the beginning. And now? They finally knew too. Richard Adams had spent his entire life at the top. He was a man who never lost, at least that's what he told himself. But that morning, as he sat in his cold, empty office, staring at the bank statement on his screen, he finally understood. He had lost. Completely. The estate, the grand home he had boasted about for years, wasn't his anymore. It never had been. It belonged to me. The company he had spent decades controlling? His shares were gone. The board had forced him out overnight. His name was no longer synonymous with power and influence. It was just another name. And soon it would be forgotten. Ethan wasn't doing any better. His termination had become public knowledge, and the business world had already moved on. Calls went unanswered. Emails were ignored. No one wanted to associate with a man who had built his career on connections instead of competence. And Sophia? She had gone from being the admired daughter of a wealthy family to a woman who had lost everything in a single night. I could imagine them all sitting in silence, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to understand how everything had unraveled so fast. But for Richard, confusion wasn't enough. He needed someone to blame. So, that evening, as I stepped out of my office, I wasn't surprised to see him waiting for me. He stood by his car, arms crossed, eyes burning with fury. I walked toward him slowly, taking in the sight of a man who had once looked down on me. Now he stood there, his expensive suit doing nothing to hide the fact that, for the first time in his life, he had nothing left to bargain with. "You think you've won," he said, his voice dangerously low. I smirked. "Richard, I don't think I've won. I know I have." His jaw tightened. "This isn't over." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Oh, it is. You just don't want to accept it." His hands clenched into fists. "You set this up. You planned this from the beginning." I tilted my head slightly, considering his words. "No," I said finally. "You set this up, Richard. You underestimated me. You played a game you thought you had already won. All I did was step aside and let you lose." He shook his head, his frustration boiling over. "You're nothing, Ryan. You were never good enough for my daughter. I knew it from the moment I met you." I chuckled, watching him unravel. "And yet, I'm the one standing here, and you're the one begging for scraps." His face turned red. "You!" I held up a hand, cutting him off. "You should go home, Richard." "Oh, wait." I paused. "You don't have one anymore, do you?" The words hit their mark. His entire body tensed, but he had no comeback. No clever remark. No plan to fix what had already crumbled. He had lost the war before he even realized there was one. I turned away, walking to my car. As I reached for the door handle, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. "Oh, and Richard?" I called out. He looked at me, hatred burning in his eyes. "You should have taken the check." Then I got in my car and drove away, leaving him standing there, powerless, defeated, and exactly where he had tried to leave me. Sophia called me 3 times that night. I didn't answer. The next morning, she tried again. This time, I picked up. "Ryan," she breathed, like she had been waiting for this moment, waiting for me to finally give in. "We need to talk." I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the skyline from my office window. The same skyline I had looked at the night I walked away from her. Back then, she had thought I was losing everything. But now she knew the truth. "What's there to talk about, Sophia?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. She hesitated. I didn't know." I smirked. "Didn't know what?" "That the house wasn't, that the company, that you?" She stumbled over her words, like she was still trying to piece together the reality she had been blind to for years. I let the silence stretch. "Ryan," she tried again, her voice softer now. "I made a mistake. I shouldn't have listened to my father. I shouldn't have." I sighed, cutting her off. "But you did, Sophia. You did listen to him. You let him convince you that I wasn't worth standing by. You thought I was nothing without your family." More silence. This time she didn't argue, because she knew it was true. "Sophia," I said, my voice steady, "tell me something." She swallowed. "What?" "If my name had been on that house, if my company had never existed, if everything had been exactly as you thought it was." I paused. "Would you still have left me?" She didn't answer. And that silence, that told me everything. I exhaled slowly. "Goodbye, Sophia." "Wait." I hung up. I didn't need to hear whatever excuse she was about to give. It didn't matter anymore. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. Richard disappeared from the social scene overnight. No one knew where he went. No one really cared. Without his money, without his power, he was just another man whose time had run out. Ethan tried to recover, tried to rebuild, but without his father's influence, the business world saw him for what he really was. An entitled, mediocre man with nothing to offer. Sophia? She faded into the background. People whispered about her, about how she had been married to a man worth more than her entire family combined and never even knew it. They pitied her. I didn't. Pity was for people who didn't have a choice. And she had a choice. A year later, I stood at the opening of my newest headquarters. A glass tower that overlooked the city. A symbol of everything I had built on my own. I had spent years trying to prove myself to people who never saw my worth. Now, I didn't need their validation. I had everything they tried to take from me. And them? They had nothing. As I looked out at the city, at the life ahead of me, I smiled. They said I wasn't good enough for them. But the truth was, I was never meant to stay in their world. I had always been destined for something greater. And now I was exactly where I was meant to be. At its core, this story isn't just about revenge or winning. It's about self-worth, resilience, and the power of knowing your own value. Too often, we let others define our worth, convincing ourselves that we need validation from people who never truly see us. But the truth? Walking away from those who underestimate you isn't a loss. It's freedom. Ryan didn't need to destroy Richard's world. Richard did that all on his own. Ryan didn't beg Sophia to stay. She walked away from the best thing she ever had. And in the end, the most satisfying victory wasn't about wealth or power. It was about finally stepping into the life he was always meant to have. Now, I want to hear from you. Did you enjoy this story? If it resonated with you, comment 2 below. If you didn't connect with it, drop a 7. I want to know what you think. And while you're here, don't forget to hit the like button. It really helps the channel grow and reach more amazing people like you. If you love stories like this, ones filled with drama, twists, and the kind of endings that leave you thinking, make sure to subscribe to Tapestry of Worlds. More stories are coming, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. So what do you think? Would you have handled things the way Ryan did? Or would you have done something different? Let's talk in the comments. ****.